Well, I'm not going to speak on blockchain technology because I don't know anything about blockchain technology, but I am going to speak on economics. When I joined the Navy, U.S. Navy in 1999, I thought, I don't know anything about national security, but I bet you my lieutenant knows something about national security. And then when I became a lieutenant, I thought, I still don't know anything about national security, but I bet you my lieutenant commander does. And then I became a lieutenant commander, didn't know anything, became a captain, didn't know anything. Eventually, I was standing with the Secretary of Defense in his office on January the 6th, and he turned to me and said, I don't know what the hell's going on, but take notes. Which says to me that a lot of people, as they go in their career, pretend to know what they're talking about, but they're just guessing. Janet Yellen really doesn't have certitude about what will happen to the dollar if interest rates go up 2.5%. But she can make an educated guess. And so that's what we're all doing here is educated guesses. I'm a recovering neocon. You're familiar with the term neocon here. It's the biggest battle that's about to come up in Washington, D.C. And earlier in the peace dividends of the post-Cold War era, the neocon outlook on American power seemed to make sense to me. I believed the story about weapons of mass destruction. I thought that we could maybe find Thomas Jefferson somewhere in the hills of Afghanistan. And I was standing in Bamyan province where they had the Buddhas, you know, that were blown up. And there was this beautiful highway that ran right down the center. It was nicer. I'm from Alabama, and it was almost nicer than any highway you could ride on in Alabama. In fact, it was. It wasn't a pothole in sight, beautifully marked. And there was a fellow with a goat or a donkey going down the side of the highway. He wasn't on the highway. He was on the side of the highway. And I said to my translator, why is he on the side of the highway and not on the highway? He said, oh, it's too nice. You didn't like my Afghan impersonation. It's all right. The name of that highway was the Laura Bush Highway, named for the First Lady. And that stuck in my mind to this day as an example of hubris, an example of neocon hubris that I shared with a lot of my colleagues. And the world is very different than it was when we built that highway back in 2008 and 2009. The United States was spending $2 billion a week on Afghanistan, building roads and infrastructure. And that experience made me an empiricist. I like to do more of what works. I'm not an economist. I'm going to talk to you here today for the next few minutes about what I see as the future of the economy. You know, economists have correctly predicted 9 of the past 5 recessions. So I don't consider myself an economist. I am an MBA, and I think MBA are business people, and the business of the American people is business, as our President Calvin Coolidge said in the beginning of the last century. But businesses give a unique perspective because they measure themselves. You either succeed or you fail. So I like to look at things through that empiricist lens of success and failure. The United States is going through a major pivot point. I had 2 friends from England visiting me this past weekend for Thanksgiving. And for those of you who haven't been to a Thanksgiving in the South, we have copious amounts of canned food and brown water. I always say, if it's not brown, put it down. And so we drank them and fed them into near oblivion this weekend. But I was thinking about, you know, they remarked as they drove through Alabama, we were on our way to do you know the Iron Bowl? Does anyone here know the Iron Bowl, the competition between Alabama and Auburn? It's a big football game. It's a religious rivalry, really. And so I took them, we'd fed them, and we had driven through the countryside in Alabama, and they had remarked on all the American flags flying around the state, and they had noted that my family prayed with fervor before our Thanksgiving meal, and then we went to the Alabama game, and 120,000 Alabama and Auburn fans were there, and they all sang the national anthem, and a bunch of F-35s roared over, and I said, and that's why we don't have free health care here in this country. But on the way back, I noted, we were talking about how America's civic pride and America's faith were so pronounced to them as Londoners, as Brits. It really stood out to them. And I said, this country is really where your country was in about 1910. We were at the peak of economic power, peak of military power, and we've been messing around in the Middle East for a few decades, and across an ocean to the west, another power is rising. For the first time since 1875, America has a peer economic competitor. The last peer economic competitor we had was Great Britain, when we passed them. And with Great Britain, we share, of course, a language, a culture, a rule of law that dates back to the Magna Carta. And so in a competition with a new peer economic rival, what does the United States need to do? I would say to you that the United States has to get real smart real fast. We can't build a bunch of Laura Bush highways anymore. We can't afford to spend money where it isn't needed. Afghanistan, we were attacking people. You know, we were using, while I was there, we had a lot of ISR. No American commander will ever say in this room here, to Senate committee, that he needs less intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. And so we were spending, you know, we'd have a $20 million Predator drone dropping a $500,000 Hellfire missile. Okay, let's use 2 of them. Just in case, make doubly sure we got the bad guy. A bunch of people back at the Pentagon, a bunch of high-priced staffers like me approving and signing off on that expenditure and that targeted hit. And so to kill a 13-year-old Afghan on a moped with $20 worth of kitchen household appliances, the United States was spending somewhere between $1 million and $5 million per hit. Is that economically sustainable? I would submit to you that it is not. And so what can we learn out of that 20 years experience? That our technology is super. If you ask, if you say to an American admiral, sir, the United States, China now boasts a larger navy than the United States, and it is not dispersed around the world from ports from Guam to Djibouti. In fact, the Chinese Navy is all in Chinese waters, and they have more ships than the United States. The answer you are going to get back, and I've heard it said in this very room, is, oh, but we have exquisite capabilities. They love that phrase, exquisite capabilities. And we do have exquisite capabilities. Who else had exquisite capabilities? From 1939 to about 1945, I would argue that the Germans had exquisite capabilities. They had the best tanks. They had outstanding aircraft. They had jet aircraft. They had ballistic missiles. There was exquisite capabilities. What overwhelmed them? A bunch of really dumb B-17s that were not exquisite, but we made them in mass numbers. So to my colleague's point, I completely agree. There is no difference between your economic might and your defense industrial base. The two are one and the same. So economically, what the United States is going to have to do is rebuild our manufacturing base. We seeded it beginning in the early 80s, and we seeded it in favor of a knowledge-based economy, a service-based economy. We thought it's okay if we don't make, shower curtain rings. It's okay if we don't make, little brass screws. We'll keep the exquisite technology. We'll keep the exquisite part, but we'll farm out and use labor arbitrage and give away these smaller manufacturing capabilities. How'd that work out for us? Apple tried to manufacture its newest pro line in Texas, and the effort failed. And the reason it failed is because they couldn't get enough screws in Texas. In this very building, we passed the CHIPS Act. The CHIPS Act was supposed to bring some very advanced manufacturing of semiconductors back to the United States. When Taiwan Semiconductor came to Arizona, they couldn't build the factory because they didn't have enough welders. They had to fly in welders from Taiwan to help us finish a factory in Arizona. And that's just a tragedy. It's a tragedy for our national security. It's a tragedy for our economy. And so I submit to you that what's being discussed right now hotly in Washington is tariffs. And the line that you will hear very often is, aren't tariffs a beggar thy neighbor proposition? Won't tariffs just become inflationary on the American people? Won't tariffs harm our allies? And speaking in a room full of parliamentarians, I'd say no. No, they won't. Democracy has to be able to defend itself. If you knew your dry cleaner was a rapist, would you go to that dry cleaner or would you choose another? If you knew your grocer was cheating on his taxes, would you go to that grocer or would you choose another? We're doing business with people who hate our way of life and who seek to destroy us. Why are we doing that? That's the basic question that tariffs asks. Why are we doing that? And everybody said, well, Morgan, you started your career at the capitalist tool. I started my career at Forbes magazine. And aren't you a free market economy? Don't you believe in the free market economy? Yes, I do believe in the free market economy. But I also believe in Adam Smith, who wrote The Wealth of Nations. And Adam Smith said, and I'm paraphrasing here, he didn't say it with an Alabama accent, certainly, but Adam Smith said, it's stupid to buy your sailcloth and your gunpowder from your enemy. What's the modern day equivalent of sailcloth and gunpowder? You know, titanium, chips, screws, 99 out of 100 rare earths we're buying from China. And not to put too fine a glaze on this ham, but that's just stupid to do that. And so that's what tariffs are about. The other argument you're going to hear against tariffs very frequently is, well, it's just going to raise the cost of goods by whatever the tariff is. Well, that is correct. It will do that. But in economic terms, does that make the country any poorer? So you raise the cost, Trump raised the cost on washing machines imported into this country by 9% in 2017. Sure enough, in 2018, the cost went up 9%. But that money came into the United States Treasury, which lets the Treasury either reduce the deficit by that amount of money or refund it in terms of a tax credit. So it's really a zero-sum game. It doesn't make the country any richer or poorer, except for the drag it took to calculate what the tariff is, which I would argue to you is marginal. My friends who argue against tariffs, and I'll end with this, my friends that argue against tariffs often say, well, they won't work. You won't get the intended effect. And this is just economic illiteracy here in Washington, D.C. So here in Washington, D.C., if you say, if you put a tax on something, you'll get less of it. Speeding tickets are essentially a tax. The idea for the government of imposing a speeding ticket on people who are speeding is to cut down on speeding. So if you impose that tax, you will get less speeding. And you'll get a lot of head nods when you say that. And then you say a subsidy encourages more of something. So if you subsidize something, you will get more of it. So if you subsidize electric cars, you will get more electric cars. And then there's the nod, right? And so if you give unemployment benefits, you will get more unemployment. And that's where the nodding stops, right? That's where everybody says, oh, economics is going to, you're just misinterpreting it. Well, you tell me. Tariffs, the idea is to encourage more production, manufacturing, targeted manufacturing, in allied countries. And I believe tariffs will get us there. The economists that have been asked about it, 99 out of 100 economists agree that the tariffs will hurt the economy. But then if you ask them, if you substitute the word tariff for carbon tax, they're like, well, no, it won't hurt. We can impose a carbon tax. It's same concept. And so I will leave you with that thought. I think it is imperative to our national security that we're able to produce our own arms and not have to turn to a competitor nation for our basic needs.
Great. Good.